Sorry, folks, I ran into the 15-minute limit of this free free software. So I was saying that we could look at the recipe and see if it sounds reasonable, but really it's the proof is in the eating about the quality here. Um, the other thing that's a challenge about appraising a qualitative research study that you didn't conduct is that the methods only tell you a fraction about what was actually done. Um, there's lots of things that people do that they don't write about. And if they've not written about it, we can't assume that they didn't do it because the standards for procedural reporting and qualitative research really vary dramatically, especially for folks who are trying to publish their qualitative research in clinical journals with very short word limits who aren't used to qualitative methods. They often omit some of the methodological richness in favor of having room to report their results in word form. So here, when we're talking about appraisal, we can specify some limited features of the ingredients or the data, but the data are always local, right? You're always having a small sample that would never be the same twice. And so if you had a different group of 30 people with the same features, you might have different findings. We're not trying for generalizable samples here. You can specify some features of the design, but a lot of it is about decisions that get made in the moment. For instance, during an interview, what elements you follow up on or what you probe for more of. And we can also specify elements of the analysis about who participated and that we did line by line coding and then we did focus coding. But what you actually do and how you see an excerpt of text and what you choose to summarize it as is not something that can be reported and really varies significantly depending on the person who's doing that analysis. There are also these sort of intangible analytic insights that come when we're walking in the woods or, I don't know, participating in some art or something that's not really about coding, but it informs what you do when you get back to your methods. The other thing is that qualitative researchers appreciate that different researchers will get different results. The same person interviewing, sorry, the same interview participant interviewed by two different interviewers might choose to share different things. The interviewers will almost surely choose to probe or to follow up on different aspects, and so that will affect the data that's gathered. And in terms of appraising, there's lots of good ones, lots of bad ones, and many studies are just sort of a matter of taste of what you're looking for them, what you're looking for from them. And I think that this is really key for policy research because what a policymaker might be looking for from a qualitative research study might be very, very different from what a qualitative researcher might be looking for, especially around the theoretical sophistication. So many of these quality appraisal tools will talk about developing a theory or the integration of theory or some kind of way of thinking about theoretical sophistication. But often policymakers want to know something very much more descriptive. What are the barriers that people encounter? Is this acceptable to them? Who is going to be challenged by this program? More than they're interested in a really rich theory about how people encounter navigate a specific intervention. So you got to read it in order to say. And there's some common versions of where things go wrong. So sometimes we have undercooked studies where the analysis is just not fully developed, or overcooked where it's analyzed beyond recognition and they've just gone too far from the data, strayed too far from the meanings that the people who were participants decided to or intended to communicate. And a lot of it is just about this sort of individual approach to the study from the researcher, the participants, and how things proceeded. So if we were to think about critical appraisal in terms of this cooking metaphor, we can talk about appraising the protocol, about does this protocol, do these methods lead us to think that they're going to get what they expect to get? Is it going to be harmful? Are there ethical considerations there? Is it original? Has somebody already done this? And does it sound like it's going to come out well? Does it sound like it's thoughtful, that it's considered the challenges, that it's integrated strategies for mitigation? And then we can appraise the report about did you make something that's worth reading, that will be helpful to someone, that will be useful to someone, that will be credible. Um, and I mentioned the conventions of reporting before, but I think it's really important to talk explicitly about this. In qualitative research, we can't necessarily assume that if it's not reported, it wasn't done, because we can't report every relevant procedural detail. And so sometimes you'll find papers that really followed a strong recipe and reported all the steps, but still ended up with a bad product, or a product that's not original, or it's not useful, or it's not interesting. And so sometimes I think of that as sort of missing this intangible analytic prowess, the ability to look at data and to see connections and to do that comparative thing, that some people just are not very good at that. So the take-home message of this is that the procedural detail that's reported is not causally linked to the quality of the research that's produced. So a few pointers about appraising methods in reports. We can think about the methodology being typically underreported or sometimes not reported at all, but we still want to look for evidence that the researcher really knows what they're doing. So do they name a methodology? And could you locate that methodology ontologically in epistemology? Like, can you see their philosophical assumption? Do they cite one methodology text, or sort of a congruent body of methodology text, not a whole bookshelf full, everyone who's ever written something that has the word grounded theory in it? Are the procedures that they're reporting, are they consistent with the method that they've declared? So if they're saying they're doing an ethnography, do we see some observation? Do we see staged coding in the methodologies that require it? We want to make sure that they're not including procedures which are inappropriate for their inference aims. So sometimes you'll see something that says we did inter-rater reliability assessment, but that's kind of meaningless for an interpretive study. So it raises a flag that these people don't really understand the full nature of the work that they're engaging in. I think that we're often looking for an iteration between data collection and analysis, something that kind of moves back and forth, unless there's some externality that makes that impossible. And some articulation of when data collection and analysis was deemed finished. So how did they decide that they had sufficient data? How did they decide that analysis was done? And then, of course, depending on the specific methodology, there are probably other things that you would look for. Each methodology has their own procedures for sampling, for data collection, etc., and they need to make sense, and they need to be congruent together. And then you're assessing the findings as well in these reports. So I think that the assessment of qualitative research is not just an assessment of the methods, it's also an assessment of the findings. Is the theory or the narrative or the argument that they're portraying in the findings, is it coherent? Is it comprehensive enough? Is every important category well defined and related to the data? Are the elements in the dynamics clearly described and related to each other? Is there a meaningful translation between participant, researcher, and audience perspectives? And is that translation clear and meaningful? Are the interpretations of the data that's exerted, so the quotes, do those interpretations seem sound when you look at that quote, or does it seem to mismatch the data that they're showing? That would be a huge red flag. The other bit is that it's important to think about the relevance and the new contribution to theory that's being made. So Melia says, and I'll give you this reference at the end of the video, if qualitative research produces analysis capable of explaining the data and offers some theoretical insights, it's doing its job. And we'd also wonder if the researchers have demonstrated successfully why we should believe them. And does the research problem that they tackled, does it have theoretical or practical significance? So these are some sort of meta questions that we could ask when we're thinking about quality. The bottom line of all of this is that no research project is perfect, but really what we're interested in is the steps that they took to make it better. Does it have more strengths than weaknesses? Do they acknowledge their limitations? Can you trust what they're saying? And are the findings relevant or useful? Okay, so just some resources that you might be interested in, and more for folks who are interested in learning more about this. These aren't sort of comprehensive exam specific resources. So here's some resources about the general sort of philosophy about quality and qualitative research. Um, the Denzin one is the one that I referred to at the beginning of the video. And then as you think about doing your own qualitative research, sometimes you just need a hook to hang a hat on, especially when you're a new researcher, a new qualitative researcher. And so here the quasi-foundationalist approach can be very useful because there's a variety of different sets of quality criteria you can look at. And there's lots of options, and I would in particular encourage you to look at your methodological resources and some of the criteria that they put forth. So on Avenue, I've uploaded a scan of the portion of a few methodological texts that discuss quality, these three that are right here. I thought that it might be interesting for you just to have a quick look through and see the diversity of approaches to quality. I also, when I was doing this, I have a whole bookshelf of qualitative texts in my office, and so I pulled out some narrative textbooks, I pulled out some ethnography textbooks, and none of them had a specific quality section that I could deduce either from the table of contents or the index in the back. And so I think that this is a point worth sharing because I think that these approaches have very different approaches to quality. They don't think of it as this sort of set of principles or guidelines that you can follow, which is very common in health research. But in the sciences, it's more often of a holistic evaluation of quality in every different stage, rather than here are the ways that we're going to evaluate quality. Health research has developed these sort of principle based approaches in part because we're so used to working with other researchers who also use principle based approaches and guidelines, and we're kind of trying to participate in that conversation. There's also a growing body of a-methodological resources or criteria for quality that might be applicable to multiple methodologies. And so I've just summarized some of these here so that you could have a sense of what's out there. The National Center for Dissemination of Disability Research Standards has some qualitative terms that they've translated from quantitative terms, often comfortable for people who are working in a more post-positivist descriptive paradigm. Ivana Lincoln, so she's another big famous qualitative methodologist, has some emerging criteria that I think are quite original, but also very insightful from some of these other more post-positivist approaches. So she talks about positionality and voice and subjectivity. Very, very interesting, and the references at the bottom there. And then Pope and Mays, we see this. It's really, really old. It's from 1995 when we were still trying to convince everybody of the legitimacy of qualitative research. But this continues to be well cited within health research, and so I think it's something that's worth being aware of. And then when we think about producing quality, that list that I had about triangulation, reflexivity, all these different approaches, there are innumerable readings on that. I think that this is not is essential to think about at this stage, but there are a couple which are on your comprehensive list. The second Finley reading here is, and then I've also uploaded to Avenue a reading from Flick about triangulation, because this is an approach that people talk about all the time and I think often get confused. And I'll leave you here with another quote from Norman Denzin that I think summarizes some of the challenge of quality criteria in qualitative research. So he says that we must resist the pressures for a single gold standard, even as we endorse conversations about evidence, inquiry, and empirically warranted conclusions. We cannot let one group define the key terms in the conversation. There is more than one version of disciplined, rigorous inquiry: counter-science, little science, unruly science, practical science, and such inquiry need not go by the name of science. We must have a model of disciplined, rigorous, thoughtful, reflective inquiry that seeks meaning but less innocently, that seeks liberation but less naively, that reaches towards understanding, transformation, and justice.